Genetically modified organisms. History of genetically modified organisms. Genetically modified organisms have been around for a long time, but they haven't always been used the way we think of them now. The idea of genetically modified organisms began with Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics. Early genetically modified organisms were used for getting favorable traits in crops, like crops which grew bigger produce. Technology has progressed a lot. The modern process for creating genetically modified organisms is relatively simple. First, a gene of interest is identified and isolated using enzymes. Then, the cut bit of DNA is placed into a plasmid, and finally the plasmid is placed in its ideal conditions and left alone to grow. Additionally, a new technique called CRISPR has been developed, which allows people with little to no scientific knowledge to create genetically modified organisms in the comfort of their own home. As science progresses, genetically modified organisms are becoming more common. Currently, 90% of all commercially grown crops have some amount of genetic modification in them. Some of the most popular uses for genetically modified organisms include insulin production, potatoes, tomatoes, and corn. Pros for GMOs. Genetically modified organisms promise to solve many of the world's biggest problems. One of the biggest problems the world faces is to end world hunger. Scientists can use genes from other sources and insert them into organisms which would allow them to grow in conditions where they naturally couldn't, like corn in the desert. Scientists can also insert genes from other sources which would allow the crops we currently have to grow more and bigger produce. Growing crops in harsh conditions and growing more and bigger produce will end world hunger forever. Additionally, by creating crops which produce more and bigger produce, there will be no need to destroy more land to create farmland. This could stop habitat destruction forever. Another problem which the world faces that can be solved by genetically modified organisms is runoff pollution. Runoff pollution happens mainly from herbicides and pesticides which are applied to farmland. After the pesticides or herbicides have been applied to the land, rain and irrigation wash away lots of the residual pesticides and herbicides, which then flow into nearby waterways, which will ultimately cause eutrophication, killing off most of the life in the waterway. A simple solution is for scientists to place herbicides and pesticides inside the genetic makeup of many of the crops that are grown. Cons of GMOs. Many people are skeptical about the use of genetically modified organisms, mainly because of the health-related side effects, which are for the most part unknown. Many studies have been done in recent years which have found that there is a strong correlation between genetically modified organism consumption and the rate of food allergies in people. Another side effect of using genetically modified organisms which worries people about using them is how they may alter the natural balance of the ecosystem. Creating crops which would be resistant to many of the pests and weeds that are not traditionally resistant to could kill off the pests, causing animals which prey on them not to have enough food, which would eventually kill them off and repeat at higher levels of the food chain. Killing off so many of the animals and plants in an ecosystem will greatly reduce the natural biodiversity in the ecosystem. Additionally, inserting herbicides and pesticides into the genetic makeup of crops would cause the few pests which are immune to the herbicides and pesticides to fill the gene pool and create a group of super weeds and insects which are immune to the herbicides and pesticides. In the end, creating genetically modified organisms is becoming easier, allowing even common people with little working knowledge of the science to create genetically modified organisms from home. There are many potential benefits of pursuing the use or science of genetically modified organisms, like ending world hunger by creating crops which can grow in harsh conditions, and stopping habitat destruction and runoff pollution by creating crops which have herbicides and pesticides in their genetic makeup. On the other hand, there are many side effects which make people uneasy about using genetically modified organisms, like the unknown health-related side effects and the creation of superweeds and insects, which will eventually result in the decreasing of biodiversity in ecosystems. In the end, it is up to the next generation to make an informed decision about the use of genetically modified organisms.